So, okay. Well, Rebecca, we were going to record something different to this, and we got talking about difficult conversations, which is live for both of us with work we're doing with different organizations, and specifically around difficult conversations, the avoidance of difficult conversations. And without going into a speech, and I do that too easily, not just say, yeah, we avoid difficult conversations. My interest is why do we avoid it? What are the issues? What are the consequences that we're seeking to dodge? So I think there's a lot around the avoidance of difficult conversations. What do you think?
It's a huge topic potentially, isn't it? I think, and I find it fascinating because avoiding difficult conversations is a missed opportunity for me, I think. And
No doubt.
yeah, it so is. And I think we avoid them for different reasons. So in a work setting, I think we avoid it because we're worried about the consequence of having, especially if there's I think in a work setting it's different because you've got the hierarchy thing, and so somebody who's lower down that hierarchy, I think, would
The lower hierarchy.
the lower hierarchy, yes, would avoid having a difficult conversation because of fear of consequences of that. So I think that's a big genuine barrier to having difficult conversations for that.
I think that too, and I've experienced that recently with a reticence I've seen in a group to do just that. Um, when basically out of code, the person was saying, I don't want to give this person this difficult feedback because I don't know how they're going to react to it. And I think, how far back do you go with this? People avoid difficult conversations. That's superficial. Behind that are the motivations and the reasons for that. That's getting somewhere, but it's not there yet. So what are the issues? What are the true driving forces that ultimately cause people to avoid it? Because avoiding difficult conversations to me is the tip of the iceberg. That's what we see. What I don't think we think about often enough, both as facilitators of other people's learning or as people ourselves in these situations, is what's causing me ultimately to dodge this.
Fear. I think there's a fear of rejection. Are they going to reject my ideas? Are they going to, it's a personal thing, isn't it? And I think that to me is a big one that holds people back, is that fear of rejection at a very deep level. It's not necessarily automatically in their head, but they don't want to be seen as I suppose there's a number of things it could be. Maybe they don't want to be seen as silly. Maybe they don't want to be seen as argumentative. Maybe, so there might be something around that as well, around what linking to their identity. Is having that difficult conversation going to impact their sense of identity?
Yeah, it could impact their employment. It does. Certainly in the world I work, you work in, dare I say, sophisticated, structured, I'm hesitating to say the words properly run, but kind of that. I very often work in pretty savage environments, which are very often privately owned, where people behave inappropriately towards other people in the sense that they shout and they swear and they get excited, that sort of all the things that would get them dismissed in a local authority or in a hospital environment or a hospital trust. I've been brought up in the private sector of people who behave less well, dare I say, sometimes, not always. They have tremendous qualities, but one thing they don't have is control over their behavior sometimes. So, yes, those people do not get these sorts of difficult conversations from people that would help them to modify their behavior and their performance. Because people say, if I tell Rebecca this, I won't have a job in the afternoon.
Mm,
But I mean, I also think I wrote this down, breaking patterns. I absolutely agree with all you've said about fear and consequence. I also think people get into a pattern. I spent 18 years of not giving Rebecca this feedback. I'm certainly not going to start now because it doesn't feel right, doesn't feel familiar. I don't know where it's going to take me. I know where my current behavior, which is of, yeah, anything you say, boss, goes. But I'm certainly not going to come in one day and says, I'd like to have a difficult conversation with you because that's something I've never done for 18 years. I think breaking a pattern is in there too.
yeah, definitely, because like you say, it becomes familiar, and therefore it becomes uncomfortable if we're breaking that pattern. So I think there's something around that, isn't there? Um, but it's interesting what you say about the different environments. And I'm not entirely sure that I agree completely with that,
Hey, we can
actually.
disagree. That's unusual.
Yeah, it is unusual because I think, and maybe I'm interpreting it wrong or differently, but I think if it's more of that family business or that smaller business that's a privately owned business, I think sometimes there is more scope for having difficult conversations,
Yes.
actually, because yeah, I need to form this in my head, but in a corporate world where you've got a very
Mm.
strict hierarchy, it's
Yeah.
actually quite
And
difficult,
rules,
and rules
contracts,
and things. So
yeah,
it's much
trade unions.
harder to have those difficult conversations because you're not necessarily able, one, you might not be able to directly speak to the person that you would like to have a difficult conversation with because there's
Yeah,
more levels of hierarchy
yeah,
within
there is.
that. And there's a lot more formality, so you can't, so you feel like you're restricted because of
Structure.
rules and structure. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely, because in many of well, I also work in hugely corporate organizations. I'm working with an 8.5 billion euro organization worldwide now, for instance. That's pretty corporate in global terms across different continents. You know about this. I still feel deeply rooted in that hugely rewarding, massively energetic, change the management structure in 20 minutes on the back of an envelope. I did that once in a Haulia client in Newport. Can't do that in a hospital trust. You can't say,
Mm.
well, let's move this person away from being clinical director and turn them into this. So there's huge energy in those organizations, and there's more access and visibility to the people who have the levers of power. They tend to be untouchable, though. I used to go into some of these organizations, and I still do, when people say, whoa, he's off, he's in a bad mood today. No, bad mood can mean anything. You're not going to get any difficult conversations for someone in bad mood in that environment. So I'm not saying these are totally different. There are similarities, but as you say, there's an insulation in big structured organizations, hierarchically and bureaucratically. There's lots around this, and where I really want to take this, though, if I can, is why do we avoid them? What are the implications and issues? Because things are driving a discomfort with having difficult conversations. Maybe it's also about articulation, about in the moment, and that's so important. Thank you, Deborah, for giving me this some years ago. In the moment when something difficult's going on, saying, right, what are the right words here? Right now when it's going on. That's a hard thing to conjure.
Yeah. I think it's partly a skill that perhaps we haven't developed because for difficult conversation, there has to be a certain level of emotional intelligence. I think that's one of the key skills of having a difficult conversation. Not everybody has that, and therefore, if you know that the person that you're speaking with isn't necessarily at the same level of emotional intelligence as you, then you don't know necessarily how they're going to respond. And I think there's that uncertainty that can again make you feel avoidant of some of these conversations.
No, there was a lot here. I mean, I ran an event over split over 2.5 days around managing difficult conversations, and I felt very uncomfortable doing that in a sense because it's not a panacea. You don't go on a short, not very many hours, however experientially led, rather than, hey, stand there and watch my slides. I didn't do any of that. You can't learn to do this in a classroom. It's got to come from you in the real world based on your experiences, your context. And everyone's different entirely in that way. So I feel very uncomfortable running any structured event for a group of people at all, by the way, but certainly around this, because you've got to be working on one-to-one.
Mm. And it is something that you have to practice. Like you say, it's not something that you can just learn and that's it, you've got it. It is a practice. And I think it's about maintaining a high standard of not necessarily professionalism. I'm not sure that that's the right word, but definitely a high standard of, I don't want to say morals, but I'm not sure that I mean morals either, but being true to yourself and respecting others at the same time. And I think this is the thing. Sometimes people feel that a difficult conversation mean that you have a different wish. And sometimes if we can agree that we want an outcome that's good for all involved, can we come at a difficult conversation, even though we may have different viewpoints on this, can we agree that actually the outcome we want is the same?
Well, we're sitting here having what we consider to be an informed conversation, but we're doing it in a sterile way. This isn't real work. We're just intellectualizing, basically. Out there in the mud and dust and chaos of bad things happening and prompting difficult conversations in the spur of the moment based on something bad happening, those things aren't ever considered. And I see that all the time. No one sits there and say, right, my boss is shouting at me because I've just done something terribly wrong, cost the firm all this money. Let me just consider the emotional intelligence factor here. And yes, and am I considering the transactional analysis? Is he behaving like a parent or an adult here? That doesn't happen. People respond with behavior. And yeah, it's so difficult. It's so hard, and we are intellectualizing. And I just want to throw something else in here, and it's we'll have to come back to all of these issues. I'm dodging in emotional intelligence. That's just too big to go down. One of the things that I worked on when I did this too short thing, introducing the idea, no more than that, of difficult conversations, is I ran one and a bit positive feedback exercise, because one of the difficult conversations we don't have is about the positive stuff, because we tend to think of difficult conversations only about bad things. The difficult conversations that are about putting things right, they're about responding to an issue which is bad. We don't have difficult conversations around, Rebecca, how often have I sat down and told you you're really good at what you do? That is a peculiar and specific type of difficult conversation that doesn't take place either.
Yeah, I think if you look in this on a sort of more personal level as well, like you say, something that I did think about when you were talking before is it's not always about negative things. It can be about the positive side of things, and I think the difficult conversations around. And this is where coaching is so valuable, is that a coach can help you explore some of these difficult, there's certain topics, isn't there, I think, that we find difficult to talk about. Some things are taboo for whatever reason, and actually taking the time out to think about these things and have these difficult conversations about what we want in life, things around life and death stuff as well, how we approach those. These are big topics, and I know we're just sort of exploring a little bit here, but there's a lot of things that we don't talk about, and it's not always all bad stuff or the negative side of stuff either.
Yeah, that's very true. And by the way, anyone listening to this, both Rebecca and myself do coaching at a very reasonable rate and show intense interest in people, and we genuinely do. Yeah, I'd go with that. And this isn't a plug about coaching. I found in a coaching context myself having clearly, because I'm told this, conversations with learning clients. In a corporate world, I differentiate commissioning clients who pays me from learning clients who I work with, and that creates some tensions of their own. But I won't get into that for another day, perhaps. I have conversations with people. I'm picturing one or two people now, I won't name, where they say, these are conversations I can't have with anyone else, Andrew. And I think, well, I'm not a therapist. And that's a difficult one. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm someone with a degree of interpersonal skills and 42 years in the learning and development industry. That's skilled me to do certain things, like ask incisive questions, like Nancy Klein asks us to. And where am I going with this? We as external parties can provide what a lot of people don't have, and that is the means to explore difficult things. Because some of these difficult conversations are with yourself. So a lot of these difficult conversations are those we have with ourselves. They're about questioning our own capabilities, our own abilities to do our jobs ultimately. And we have those conversations all the time, which means that those difficult conversations are not being had where they should be being had in the workplace.
And I think, and again, I mean, there's so many topics we could go off, and explore from this. And I think one of those is around how, and we sort of briefly touched on this before, is how do you create the right environment to have these difficult conversations? Because that's, if you haven't got that right environment, then they're just not going to happen, and I think that's part of the key here, is creating the right environment to have difficult conversations.
I'm almost hesitating to say any more because there's so many ways we could take this. So I think rather than do that, let's say this, as we said before, is a topic we'll return to. We're just skimming over this, but I think we've raised some good issues there and plenty to return to. So with a glance at the clock and realizing that we're getting close to or beyond the 15 minutes, which is kind of where we try to limit this to, there's more to come on this, folks. Tune in for more from the station. Thanks, Rebecca. That's useful to me.
Thank you.